Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today, we're going to start talking about voting rights in the United States and basically how that has changed over time. Because the voting rights that we have today are not the same that they've always been. And they have changed over time quite a bit from what the original requirements to vote in the United States have been. And we're going to walk through a lot of that today. Not only what the changes are, but why it happened and why it has changed so much. Like, if there's a set rule, why is it so fluid? And why is it different in different parts of the country? So we're going to go through and we're going to talk about that today. All right, let's get started. All right, so we're moving in talking about voting and elections. Really today, we're just going to really focus on what the requirements are in the Constitution and what the requirements are today in order to be able to cast a vote in the United States. Generally speaking, we talk a lot more about federal level because it's so different on the state level. So this is more for the federal elections, things like the president and Senate races and things like that. Before we get started here, there is a vocab word you have to know. Absolutely have to, because it's not a super intuitive vocab word. It's not a word that you hear it and you immediately know what it is. That vocab word is suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. The reason I want to really drive that home here early on is because it is a common word to not naturally know. I know this for a fact because when I was just a young man and I was at East Carolina University, that they would do a thing each year. The sociology department would do it. This is way back in the day, in which they would stand out on campus, and there's over 20,000 people that went to this university. So like in between like classes, it would be packed there in the center of campus. The sociology department would stand out there, men, boys and girls, a big old sign that says, "End women's suffrage now." And the whole process was basically to see what type of groupthink you can get. So obviously, the term "end women's suffrage now" is basically saying, let's stop women from voting. However, they know that people will see that, and they see there's women getting people to sign up, and it's like young people, and we're all 18, 19 years old at the time, and 20 and 21 and college age. So we're motivated to make changes, and so people see that, and they would think, if they didn't know what the vocab word is, that it means suffering. Naturally, that's where your brain goes. Is suffrage means like, so in women's suffrage, like, I don't want women to suffer like it's an anti-abuse campaign to help out battered women and things like that. Tons of people go and sign this petition, because they go out. Anybody's walking by, hey, we signed this petition to end women's suffrage, and tons of people would sign it. And then the next day at the paper, they would publish all the people's names who don't think women should have the right to vote. In the local web. Now, it is a big caveat. Like, it is I doubt they do it now because somebody would get too offended by it. And probably did then too, because you're basically taking their ignorance of not knowing a vocab word and really misconstruing the context. Because I truly doubt anybody signing that. It's like, yeah, women don't deserve the right to vote. I would hope nobody's signing that with that understanding. So I say that because I've seen it happen, of the not knowing what the vocab word suffrage means. So whenever you hear the word suffrage here, it's talking about the right to vote. Got to know that, got to ingrain that in your brain, because it's just a term that gets used second nature in civics. When you talk about the right to vote, it is suffrage. All right. So let's get started here. Let's talk about the requirements to be able to vote in the United States. So the original ones, voting requirements may seem a little odd, and we're going to go through and explain it why. All right, let me get there. Boop, 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 boop. So the first requirement is you have to be 21 years old. This really wasn't a huge issue at first. Basically, they just wanted adults. So I guess they just had to pick an age. I don't really know why 21 got like snatched out of the air. They probably had a reason somewhere. for it. You've lived at least 2 decades. I don't know what the rationale for 21 was. There's really nothing else that really connected to being 21 at the time that I am aware of. There may be. But you had to be 21 years old to vote. All right. This is kind of the initial requirements. Now, I should also point out, these are the initial requirements strongly suggested by the federal government. This isn't really listed in the Constitution. The 21 is, but some of the other ones that are more fluid that we're going to talk about aren't like verbatim listed in the Constitution. It's left up to the states to decide their rules for allowing people to vote. Over time, the federal government will get involved and open it up to more people, but the initial ones were very strict. So the first requirement, you had to be 21 years old to vote. The next one is you had to be white. All right. Now, today, this seems crazy. All right. And it is. I mean, it's clearly discriminating against, they just wanted white people to vote. What's crazy is at the time, what we think of as white now is actually a more exclusive thing. This is a picture of an Italian family coming over from Europe. They would not, at the onset of the new Constitution, probably would not have been allowed to vote. The Italians would not have been considered white. Now, it depends on your state, your population. It's a fluid, so it's not a justified, because race in general is a man-made concept, kind of like to rank people based on arbitrary physical attributes. So it's fluid in some areas on what is considered white and what is not. But you had to be 21 years old and you had to be white. Also, the vast majority of people in the United States, other than slaves, which is a whole massive situation, I'm definitely not ignoring that, the majority of people were white. So while today it seems crazy that they have such a racist, literally the actual definition of white supremacy, and only white people can vote, that is a supreme ability of white people. When you're 80 to 90% of the population that is not a slave, I can't justify it, but at the time, there wasn't a lot of people who were like, that's crazy talk, because the people that wouldn't fit into that category of being white was a smaller percentage, so it wouldn't seem as outrageous as today. But again, I say that, excluding anybody today, rightfully so, is outrageous. So you had to be white, you had to be 21, you had to be white, and you had to be a property owner. You had to own property. So the reason that is, and it seems very elitist, doesn't it? Because one of the big issues people had in England was the inability to own property because of primogeniture. So people came to the New World in order to start over. So now you're saying, well, only property owners can vote. That seems very much the feudalist nobility concept back then. The idea is, and James Madison talks about this quite a bit, that it's a lot easier to own property in the United States. What they don't want is they don't want all this riffraff coming over here that's poor and they're not owning property. They're not connected to the land. They're not paying taxes, because property, you pay taxes. Like you're committed to grow, like you're invested in the society as a property owner is the idea. So therefore, you just want property owners because you're afraid that if you just let anybody vote, it'll get out of hand really quick. Which this is going to be one of the first ones to go away as a requirement. And you also had to be male. You also had to be a guy. So you had to be a property owner, white, a dude, and 21 years old. So basically, who can vote? These guys. Look how diverse our voting block is. You got wealthy white male landowners that are over 21 years old. How diverse do you think the electorate is? Not very much. So, not surprisingly, basically all the laws dealt with this group of the population. Because politicians really only care about the people that can vote for them. All right? So, over time, it becomes pretty obvious that this is not an effective way of running the country. You have to open up voting rights to more people. So, present day, It has changed. So let's talk about present day, what the rules are, and then we're going to go through some of the events that happened that caused these changes. So one of the biggest ones is it's not 21 years old anymore. It is 18 years old. And we talked about this in the amendments, and we're going to talk about it again later in this lesson because it's a very important situation. The reason it goes from 21 years old to 18, all right, is because 18-year-olds can be drafted to go fight for the United States. And so the argument is if you can die for your country, you should be able to vote for the people that are choosing to send you against your will, possibly, to go fight for your country. And that came out with Vietnam. Vietnam, at the time, in the 60s and 70s, they were drafting 18-year-olds to go send them to fight in Vietnam, but you couldn't vote till 21. So in the eyes of the government, you weren't old enough to cast a vote, but you're old enough to go fight and die for your country. This ends up being an amendment, and that's a pretty strong argument that, hey, if you're going to draft us, you got to let us vote. So you have, today, it's 18 years old. You have to be a U.S. citizen. This was not an original requirement because that concept didn't really come about for a few years after the Constitution, because anybody that was here would be invested in a current society. The concept that you kind of belong and have a membership to an individual country is something that's going to get solidified a little after the Constitution. So today you have to be a U.S. citizen. You also have to be registered to vote. There is a little caveat that North Dakota doesn't do that. It's a smaller population. You have to register. The reason they want you to register to vote is so that when you show up to vote in an election, they have your name on a list, and that you register to put your name on a list. When you show up and you vote, they mark your name off. That way you can't just go keep getting in the back of the line and keep voting over and over and over. So the idea of registering to vote is basically to keep it fair and keep multiple votes from happening from the same person. One of the biggest fluctuations in voting laws has to do with felons. If you're a convicted felon, can you vote? Depends on the state that you live in. All right. So places like Arizona, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Iowa, Wyoming, these places that are orange on this map, you very easily, if you're convicted of a felony, you permanently lose your right to vote. You can't vote anymore. A lot of the states, most of the states, once you serve your time, like if you're convicted of a felony and you either go to prison, you have community service, whatever you're doing to repay your debt to society, after you do that, after you repay your debt to society, you then get the ability to vote again. Maine and Vermont and Washington, D.C., they are outliers where they do not take anybody's right to vote. Even if you're in prison, you can still cast a vote from prison. So it's interesting that voting in federal elections and the right to vote is so pivotal, but states themselves can decide who gets to vote and what their specific requirements are for that. And it has led to some wildly shameful discrimination throughout history, especially with African Americans, and with the civil rights movement and the things they did to prevent, especially the southern part of the United States, the laws that got passed to prevent African Americans from voting, even though they had already been given the right. But that's a whole bunch of interesting stories for another lesson. All right, so the question is, what was the reason for the voting age change from 21 to 18? And why do many people view this as a positive and logical change? Like, why does that clearly make sense? And we had talked about that, so pause me, answer this in complete sentences, and we're moving on. All right, so let's go through the people who were denied the right to vote, but I want to go through this more specifically in the order that it happened and how different groups gained the right to vote, all right? So let's start with that property ownership one, which seems kind of crazy. It's kind of an elitist idea that you had to own property in order to vote in the United States. Well, that's going to change with Andrew Jackson. Well, we talked about him a little bit the other day. So Andrew Jackson, 7th president of the United States, He's very much an everyman. So he's a war hero from 1812, comes into the presidency. First president that we had that did not actually actively help write the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. And he very much represents the average person. Well, not everybody could own property. Yes, it may have been easy, 100 years before this, but you still have to earn money, own property, not renting. So Andrew Jackson really goes through and makes the push to eliminate that requirement from all the states of property ownership, and is very effective of that. In that. So by the 1830s, that whole concept that you had to own property goes away. And that is Andrew Jackson's doing very much so. So now adult white males that are over the age of 21 can vote. So that's where we are about the 1830s. Let's fast forward through a whole bunch of stuff, including the Civil War. The 15th Amendment gets passed. The 15th Amendment gives freed slaves that were freed with the 13th Amendment. They're given citizenship with the 14th Amendment. 15th Amendment gives African American, not just African American males, because women still at this point by 1860s do not have the right to vote. So it gives the right to vote to African Americans with the 15th Amendment. It is interesting that the 15th Amendment doesn't say all races can vote. It will eventually be interpreted that way. It says African Americans because there are still parts of the country that want to discriminate against different groups. So it does not say all races. It still allows some ability to discriminate against people like Asian Americans, Asians that immigrants that were coming in from the West Coast. That'll start happening at the time. So, but the 15th Amendment gives African Americans the right to vote. What's interesting, we'll mention this here in a little bit, and then we'll go in a whole nother lesson. We'll go into it in a lot more detail over, even though they had the right to vote, they would aggressively be denied the ability to do that. Even though the Constitution says they have a right to. The states, because they enact the laws, found workarounds to much of these requirements for African Americans to vote through poll taxes and literacy tests and things like that. But the 15th Amendment gives African American males the right to vote in the 1860s. So women didn't have the right to vote. Women will gain, with the 19th Amendment, the right to vote, which officially goes into effect in 1920. It was created in 1919, goes into effect in 1920. But you can see here that leading up to that, a lot of the states realized, yeah, this is kind of ridiculous that women, half the population, aren't allowed to vote. And you can see a lot of these are going to start after the 1860s. And a big reason for that is the logic for not giving women the right to vote. While yes, it is sexist, it wasn't totally sexist. The logic was each household was supposed to have one vote. The male, and everybody just assumed, husband, wife, kids, and the husband, sits down with his family, decides, how should we vote as a family, and then he would go cast his family vote. That was some part of the thought. I'm not suggesting at all that women were considered marginalized parts of the population. They absolutely were. But it wasn't completely based on women don't know what they're thinking. It was the idea that each family had one vote. Well, if you notice, these start happening after the 1860s. You know what had happened in the 1860s? The Civil War. When you wipe out an entire generation of men, women, who are now the head of the household, have to do the men and women's job. They don't have a say-so in the government. So this is when women start saying, hey, women should have the right to vote as well. So they start, the states start applying it, and then it's when World War I happens. Very quickly, they agree, and the 19th Amendment is passed, which fundamentally makes women eligible to vote. And once you get the right to vote, once African Americans got the right to vote, all right, once people without property got the right to vote, once women got the right to vote, you know who the government starts caring about? You know who politicians start caring about? The people that can vote. So getting the right to vote is very important in order to get the government to care about it. Because if you can't vote, the government doesn't care about you. The most extreme version of that, and this blows my mind, Native Americans, the people who were here before the colonists, did not get the right to vote until 1924, and they're actually given the right to vote before they're given the right to vote before they're actually allowed to be citizens. 1927 is when Native Americans are allowed to be American citizens, but they're given the right to vote in 1924. So all these other groups, the last main group that they make a conscious effort to allow them to vote is the Native Americans, the ones that have been here from the beginning. Proof in the pudding that unless you have the right to vote, you don't have a lot of pull. Once Native Americans get the right to vote, you'll start seeing laws and things set up for Native Americans that is unique to that group of people based on the history that has happened and their lineage that they were here first. So the question here is, why was the requirement to own property an original requirement to vote in America? So we had talked about this a little earlier with James Madison's view on that. So if you'll pause me, answer that in complete sentences, and we'll move on. All right, so how did each of these things expand suffrage? That's that vocab we got to know. Suffrage, the right to vote. All right, so let's go through these here. The 15th Amendment, and we already talked about this, gives African Americans the right to vote, whereas previously they did not. They were slaves. So the 13th frees them, 14th gives them equal citizenship, and the 15th gives them the right to vote, which once again, once you have the right to vote, you can influence the government, and the government then cares about your views. 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. So the government comes in and gives women the right to vote. We've already mentioned both of those here in this lesson. The 23rd Amendment. So Washington, D.C. did not get the right to vote because they're a city. That's where the capital is. So they're not technically inside a state. So there's, and the states get the right to decide on voting requirements. Well, their argument, and we passed an amendment to allow the people in that city a right to vote in federal elections, even though they're not in a state, because their argument is, well, we still have to pay taxes, and we have no representation. Isn't that what the the entire argument over the Revolutionary War is no taxation without representation? And that's a pretty solid argument. And they're like, okay, so there's an amendment in the Constitution, the 23rd Amendment, which gives people in Washington, D.C. that live there and work there the right to vote because they're not under a state's jurisdiction designed that way so a state can't control the federal government. So there's special rules for Washington, D.C. One of the things that comes out and is the civil rights movement, and we're going to talk about that in this course quite a bit. States in the South, even though African Americans had the right to vote, they started doing literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clause, stuff to prevent African Americans from voting. Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965 passed the Voting Rights Act, says you cannot, federal law, like yes, states can do this and that, but from now on the federal government says you cannot charge somebody to vote, because they were specifically targeting African Americans to prevent them from voting so they don't have a voice in the government, so that white supremacists could continue to run the area. So Lyndon B. Johnson, this is a quote, says, "This is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country." Now, as everything in history, nothing is cut and dried. Lyndon B. Johnson, pretty much a race by today's standards. I say racist. His policies don't seem to reflect that, but the dude's been called on, recorded all the time, dropping the N-word with the hard R. Like, what? So this guy does all these great things for African Americans' ability to, great things for him. He basically just allows them to do what they should have been able to do the whole time. But is an advocate for the African American right to vote himself, is questionable on his personal life anyway, that's beside the fact. But the Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically eliminates a lot of these restrictions states were putting on people to prevent them from voting, which would most specifically focus on African Americans. The 24th Amendment comes out after that, which they end up making it an official amendment. You cannot charge somebody to vote. That is a right in the United States. You can't charge somebody to vote. The 26th Amendment, and we've already talked about that, it was with Vietnam, lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. All right, so if you're old enough to fight, you're old enough to vote. Suffrage is extremely important in the American democracy because our entire society is run by the people. We have a government that is designed for the people. The more people that vote, the more representative our government is of the people and the more easily they can adapt to the actual needs of the people. If you're just 21-year-old white male landowner, those are the only people that are getting looked after under the federal government. As you open the voting abilities up to more people that represent our country, the more you vote, the more attention you're going to get by the federal government, because when you have the right to vote, it is an ultimate weapon in a democracy. So the more people that have the right to vote, the better a democracy and the more diverse of a society that we're going to have. So that's what the question is here, is why is suffrage such an important part of American democracy? Why is America a better place for more people when more citizens are allowed to vote? So answer that in complete sentences. And that's all we got for the day. See you guys tomorrow.